Now, a lot of cars today have very expensive automatic transmissions, and you'll notice, coincidentally enough, by the time you roll 100,000 miles over on the odometer, quite often you're starting to have issues, drivability issues. Now, a lot of times people driving CVTs, Jatcos, Nissans, if you're not doing your regular fluid changes on those, you're probably going to see a failure well before that. As well, on top of that, even Hondas, Toyotas, you've got to change fluids, or any manufacturer, you should be thinking about doing some fluid maintenance changes. Now, that said, if you have a higher mileage used car, you may not want to change the fluid because quite often it stirs up some of the metal, particulate, and sludge and could create a new problem. That said, if you're driving a new car, make sure you follow the instructions for maintenance and keep that vehicle in top shape, because drivability issues are likely to start rolling in. Because at 100,000 miles, all of a sudden you put it in gear and you go to touch the gas and you'll notice that delay, and then all of a sudden there's a little bump. Quite often you'll notice little nuances, little problematic driving issues, little slips, little juddering, possibly a little bit of noise. And if you're driving an automatic transmission or even a CVT, there may be in fact be more noise, more delays, a little rougher drivetrain, harder shifting, or even just slipping. These are all facts that start to roll in, and 100,000 miles just seems to be the sweet spot. Now, a lot of times these vehicles, they also have maintenance schedules. You want to make sure you tackle that. BMW, a lot of these manufacturers use ZF 8-speed automatic transmissions, which claim those are good for the life of the vehicle. That's not entirely true. Well, some of those say at the manufacturer level, when you actually go to the supplier of the transmission like ZF, they'll actually say there is a maintenance requirement. Whatever, suffice it to say, maintenance is a must. If you want to keep that vehicle running long, you're likely going to have to take care of your transmission, because that's one of the most expensive parts of a car. But if you don't, 100,000, 120,000 miles is likely where you're going to start seeing some major problems. Why do you think the warranties are gone after 60,000 miles or 100,000 miles? Because the manufacturers know the law of averages means at 100,000 miles, they're out of the woods, and they don't care what you've been doing for maintenance, because after the warranty's gone, it's all on you. More changes to your vehicle when you start rolling into 100,000 miles, all kinds of holes, cracks in the road, potholes, and other imperfections in the road challenges your suspension, and every mile you drive down the road challenges the components within your suspension. Whether you're talking about sway bar links, you know, those little 4 or 6 inch links that have a couple of bushings on either end that help to keep the stability of the vehicle. Whether you're talking about ball joints, they tend to take a bit of a toll as well. And all of a sudden shocks, struts are all taking a toll, and they all start to wear. And it seems as though around the 70, 80, 90, 100,000 miles is where you start to see a little bit additional wear. Most cars these days, unless they're driven on perfect roads, tend to get beat up pretty hard, and a lot of those parts start to wear very prematurely. Now, you might start getting some clunking noises, you might start getting veering, possibly vehicles that don't stay on course, maybe your steering wheel's off center a little bit, or possibly you're getting weird wear patterns on your tires. Might be an indication that you have components that are out of sync, out of alignment, and possibly just worn out. So a lot of times your suspension is critical to maintain. But at 100,000 miles, you're going to start expecting to spend some dollars on a lot of your suspension, and especially on the front end. Most vehicles these days have a very complex front end suspension, a lot of them with all-wheel drive. Of course, naturally you have your steering components do also work a little harder, and the front end of the vehicle is especially critical to keep in line. That's how you control your vehicle, but unfortunately with all of the additional moving parts, that's where you're likely going to see extra wear and tear. The rear suspension, independent suspension of course as well, we'll see wear and tear, but not usually quite as bad as the front. The big thing there, quite often you're looking at sway bar links, and shocks or struts are usually the areas you're going to find wear. So if your vehicle's bobbing a lot, you're hitting those big dips in the road and the vehicle tends to bob, that's quite often a sign when you're losing your dampening power that your struts or shocks are worn out. Clunking noises, clicking noises, whether you're turning or whether you're hitting sharp bumps or cracks in the road, all of a sudden you hear tick, 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 quite often are signs of bad bushings or any kind of other components that keep your suspension geometry intact. So when you start hitting those higher miles, 100,000 miles plus, it's no wonder you're starting to get weird looseness in the drivetrains, weird looseness in the steering, and just an overall sloppiness in the overall driving. It's no wonder a lot of people like to get into a brand new vehicle after 3 or 4 years, because by the time 5, 6, 7 years rolls around, the vehicles are quite often very worn out, start making weird noises, grinding, clunking, clicking, and ticking, and that's why those are some classic symptoms of a bad suspension that starts to need some repairs. If you're liking the video so far, you're gonna love the rest of the channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button down below, and don't forget the notifications bell so you know when the next amazing videos come. Now, another issue that creeps in there around 100,000 miles often impacts vehicles like this. Smaller, usually subcompact. A lot of foreign vehicles tend to use a lot of belts. And Hondas, even though this generation here uses a timing chain, many other Hondas, you know, possibly CRVs and beyond, quite often use timing belts. Timing belts and Hondas generally say around 100,000 miles they've got to be swapped out. And fortunately, this one's got a chain, you don't have to deal with that. And many other cars use timing chains as well. Many European cars like these ones here also use timing chains. But timing chains aren't always out of the woods either, because timing chains have tensioners. They ride on guides, they have tensioners that are pressurized by oil, and poor oil maintenance and neglect can quite often lead to poor tensioner behavior. And then of course you can get rattling noises, chain noises, and all kinds of problems there. So timing chains used to be considered for the life of the engine, but now some engines can run hundreds of thousands of miles, and it's a consideration sometimes that timing chains may have to be swapped out too. But timing belts, almost always every car manufacturer dealing with between 60 and 100,000 miles, timing belts are something that need to be considered, because that's likely when they're getting to be on a higher risk. Now, timing belts rotate and connect up, synchronize between your crankshaft, which is the rotating mass of the engine fired by the pistons, and of course your camshafts, which operate the valves. Well, between those two, they have to be in perfect sync. And if the timing belt ever breaks and it becomes a much higher risk after 100,000 miles, then you risk a huge potential failure, which might mean on an interference type engine that you could have a piston running into some valves if that timing belt breaks, and that will essentially wipe out your engine. A very expensive repair and a very expensive neglect on that timing belt maintenance. So never neglect your maintenance, and unfortunately that's just something around 100,000 miles you're going to have to be thinking about. Check your owner's manual for your vehicle specifically, but typically a lot of foreign vehicles, a lot of Japanese and Korean vehicles quite often are running timing belts, and just something you have to be thinking about. Now, rust is another area of concern. I started getting rust on this vehicle at around that 70, 80,000 mark. And even though this is just superficial on the chrome, a lot of times there's extra rust starting to develop, whether it's at the bottom of door panels, whether it's at the bottom, you get it around the gas cap or the tail end here of the rear extension of the fender. Cars often start to rust 70, 80, 90, 100,000 miles, or at least 5 or 6 years down the road. And it depends if you live in one of those countries or states, maybe in a rust belt. Think of Eastern US, think of Eastern Canada. Those areas, they use a lot of that liquid salt, and it absolutely eats and corrodes at the underside of a lot of these vehicles. So rust is something you're going to likely be dealing with. Once you sort of roll in that $100,000 territory, you're probably going to start seeing more and more rust. Some of these vehicles nowadays, a lot of modern day vehicles, are using a lot more aluminum. As you see, aluminum parts won't rust. Of course, lots of plastic. There's lots of composites, aluminum body panels, plastics down there on typical rust zones like that. This is also plastic. Now this turns to metal, but again, more plastic. So there's less and less steel in a lot of these vehicles. And the little bit that they use is quite often well absorbed and protected by a lot of the plastics and composite materials. So modern vehicles quite often resist rust a lot better. There's better metallurgy, but it's something to think about, especially on certain lower level vehicles. Some vehicles just clearly are built out of steel, and they will likely see rust. And it's something you've got to be thinking about. The best way to resist a rusty vehicle is to take care of it from day one. Make sure you're always cleaning your car very well. Make sure you're giving it a good wash, not just from the outside, and that you're cleaning it with a nice lint-free microfiber type towel, but you're also spraying underneath the rocker panels and making sure that all of along the bottom side of the vehicle is getting sprayed down and washed accordingly, and done very, very frequently. Don't forget to wash in the fender wells. Make sure you catch these fender lips, because quite often these fender lips tend to hold up a lot of debris, and sand and grit tends to lock up in there, and then that just starts to rust. So make sure that you're always spraying all those areas underneath the vehicle. Is the most critical spot for any kind of rust prevention. Some people also say that you can mitigate a lot of that from brand new with rust protection that they often spray within the chassis, and you get those specialists that will stick those straws in strategic spots. But I personally think a lot of that is voodoo magic. There's also that cathodic protection systems that you can actually mount on some of these vehicles. And from my personal experience, it's again a little bit more voodoo magic. There is some reality to cathodic protection with anodes. Whether it actually works properly on a vehicle of this type and this magnitude is beyond me. I haven't seen enough case studies to verify or validate. Anything you can do to reduce the contamination, the salt and the grit on your vehicle will prevent rust, because a vehicle that starts to rust, you just start losing interest in. And when you start losing interest because the way it looks due to some rust, then you start neglecting other parts, mechanical components and other areas. And then of course, everything starts to go out the window. And then it's sort of a snowball effect and just letting that vehicle deteriorate completely. Another area of failure, of course, typically around 100,000 miles, you may start to see the odd coolant leak. You may have cracked fittings, pipes, hoses, because a lot of these, if the pH isn't set up correctly, in other words, if you neglect your coolant, then quite often that coolant turns acidic, or it just basically turns base. You either get extra buildup in the cooling system and it actually reduces its cooling potential, or you just get more of an acidic level, and that unfortunately starts to eat away at hoses and pipes and cooling lines like this. And a lot of these systems in these modern day vehicles have a lot of these snap together fittings. They're very expensive to replace, but what you might start to notice is little white speckles around fittings, white speckles down in the lower engine compartments. You might see white speckles on the front of the engine, because in most cases the water pumps are quite often mounted on the front of the engine. So if you see little white speckles, white dots mounted throughout, that might be a sign that you've got a leak of a cooling line, cooling hose, or even your water pump. Water pumps are common failures in that 80 to 120,000 mile range, and even more so it seems in a lot of the European models. But water pumps, whether they're electric and they're driven off the electric system, or whether they're mechanical and they're driven off the crankshaft hub, either way, they're likely going to start leaking, or they might start making noises. So ultimately, you want to make sure your water pump is getting replaced at the respective time. But just to consider that your typical water pump might cost you parts and labor anywhere from $500 up to $2,500. If you're dealing with a modern day Mercedes or BMW, some of those actually have electric water pumps and access is weak on them, and then they usually do a thermostat while they're at it, and that ends up costing you over $2,000 parts and labor. Or if it's just a good old-fashioned mechanical water pump like a lot of cars still use, it might only be a few $100s. Some of them are even easy to do yourself. But ultimately, water pumps, you're going to spend some money there. You're going to spend some money on some of the cooling lines and the hoses, and maybe you have a cracked lid. Sometimes these start to leak, and sometimes they don't seal properly, so you might have to think about possibly expansion tanks sometimes crack on the seams, or these hoses, water pumps. There's a whole plethora of issues, including the thermostat, could lead to coolant leaks, and you might see some of the coolant leaks on the ground. You might see a big spot on the ground that eventually evaporates after a couple of days. That might be a sign that you've got a coolant leak rather than an oil leak, and it's something you need to be taking note of and possibly getting your vehicle to the shop as soon as possible. Because naturally, if you run your coolant level low, then you risk blowing your engine. Overheat an engine, burn head gasket, and then you've got really expensive repairs. So never neglect your cooling system, but that's something likely water pumps and the rest of it are likely to start failing around that 100,000 miles. Another area, one of the most costly areas that you're going to be thinking about when the vehicle gets up there in mileage, you might start it up one day and you get a little bit of that, a little startup. That might be your timing chain. Maybe the tensioners are getting a little loose. That can happen. Unfortunately, sometimes you get a weird panging and banging, and sometimes piston slap. Sometimes a little extra wear and tear on your piston rings. You might also notice that you're adding a little bit of extra oil sometimes. You're having to add oil now where you never did. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you never had to add oil between oil changes, and now you might find that you're adding a half a liter between oil changes, because by the time you're at 100,000 miles, quite often you're now starting to burn a little bit of oil. You're also possibly seeing oil leaks from the oil pan gasket that's at the very bottom. A lot of times now they're using plastic oil pan gaskets. Valve cover gaskets you're starting to see issues with as well. Cam housing issues. Sometimes power steering pumps. A variety of different coolant leaks and engine oil leaks are likely going to be starting to show up in that 80 to 110,000 mile range. 100,000 miles, you're likely to start hearing different sounds, cold starts, making weird noises, drivability, maybe some sluggishness. And now good maintenance can go a long ways, and certainly doing your frequent oil changes is going to really help. But there is a reality that wear and tear at 100,000 miles could start taking a toll, and you're starting to notice some leaks. You're going to start having to replace some gaskets the odd time. Oil filter housing gasket right down there. You can see that's not an uncommon issue with some Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs. A lot of the new BMWs, the B48 and the B58s, have the oil filter housing right here, and that then starts to leak. It sometimes mixes oil and coolant, sometimes leaks oil, sometimes just coolant, and sometimes it's a leak along the engine to the cooler interface, the cooler, of course, to the housing interface. And there's a couple of big gaskets in there. A lot of those are crush gaskets, a lot of them are rubberized gaskets, but nonetheless, a lot of them can be exposed to oil and start to break down, because we know that oil does take a toll on some older style gaskets, and so leaks are not going to be uncommon. 100,000 miles, you might see the odd little drip. Now, that's usually a little higher mileage, but they're not uncommon to see a little drop, maybe a little dime-sized drop of oil on the concrete there after you drive away, and you wonder what happened there. Well, there could in fact be the beginnings of something more substantial. Engine leaks, oil, coolant, and unfortunately some weird engine noises are likely all going to be there, as well as some extra heavy oil consumption. Some of the overall drivability might be going away, and you'll start recognizing at 100,000 miles, things just aren't what they were about 50,000 miles ago. Then, of course, as you roll into that 200,000 miles, if you happen to have a car that makes it that long, well, you'll really notice issues. There's definitely going to be leaks, substantial leaks, drivability problems, but by the time you have a vehicle that makes it to 200,000 miles, you probably just keep on driving it. Just keep the basics going and just keep it running as long as physically possible. And with all of that said, if you're buying a new car, definitely want to check out the list of those most reliable cars of 2025. You're definitely not going to want to miss those. We know how expensive these cars are to fix. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. We'll see you real soon. See you later, everybody. Bye-bye.